The Electile Dysfunction Podcast with Ashton Cohen.
Welcome back to the Electile Dysfunction Podcast with Ashton Cohen. I'm Ashton Cohen. I'm joined today by former IDF, Israeli Defense Forces Brigadier General Amir Avivi. Amir Avivi is currently the CEO of IDSF, the Israel Defense and Security Forum. And we're going to talk about Israel today, get perspective from someone who is intimately familiar with the inner workings of Israel's military, its national security, and foreign policy. We're also going to talk about geopolitics in the Middle East and in the world, and how this current conflict with Russia and Ukraine sort of shapes things up, where it's going. So Amir, thanks so much for being with me today. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you for having me, Ashton. It's a pleasure. Good to be here.
Thanks, Ed. So let's start off with the current situation. I'd love to get your perspective in terms of, Israel's this has kind of been foreshadowed by the larger conflict with Russia and Ukraine. It seems to be Israel has been dealing with a new slate of terror attacks. Meanwhile, according to the Jerusalem Post and some other sources, Iran seems to be provoking Hamas and other Palestinian terrorists to ratchet up attacks. There's ongoing discussions about the JCPOA, the Obama-Iran nuclear deal, as some people refer to it. They're currently going on in Vienna. And one of the interesting things about that is that America's relying on Russia to sort of broker our position with regards to Iran. Meanwhile, we're condemning Russia on the world stage. Talk to us about the security threats Israel is dealing with right now and how it sees the situation in the Middle East.
I think that we need to understand really the broader picture of what is happening in Israel and around us. And I would say that Israel is under attack by two very big campaigns that are also interacting between these campaigns. One is an overall Palestinian campaign, I would say, against Zionism and against Israel. And this campaign is conducted all over Israel, in Judah, Samaria, the Negev, the Galil, the cities, mixed cities, Jerusalem, and so on. And what we are witnessing is an attempt, a long-term attempt to completely destroy the sense of rightness and connection of Jews to the land of Israel. We see it, by the way, also on the global level, talking about BDS and all these campaigns, talking about Palestine will be free from the river to the sea. Of course, there is no Israel in this scenario.
Right.
Nobody is talking anymore about a two-state solution or Judah and Samaria. It's completely destroying the right of Jews to live anywhere in Israel. We also see, as part of this campaign, an attempt to grab land. We see it in Judah and Samaria. The Palestinians are very active in taking land in Area C, but we also see it in the Negev with the Bedouins, and we see it in the Galilee. And of course, very strong attempt to completely undermine the personal security of Jews anywhere in the land of Israel. So of course, we see it on the roads in Judah and Samaria, where they throw Molotov bottles, rocks, or shoot. We see it in the Negev. We see it also in Lod, in Acre, in Jerusalem, Galilee, and so on. And part of that is also conducting terror attacks. So it's all over the place. And it's more and more coordinated between Hamas, fractions of the Israeli Arab society, and Palestinians in Judah and Samaria. And this is what we witnessed in the last operation in May. On one hand, we saw thousands of rockets being shot at Israeli cities, including Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. At the same time, an uprising of Israeli Arabs and pogroms against Jews all over the place. We haven't witnessed something like that since the Independence War. And at the same time, also some shooting from Lebanon and attempt of attack from Syria. So everything is connected, everything is coordinated at some level. And this is what's going on inside Israel, and the potential is huge for a major uprising. And then now we're talking more and more about the need to build the National Guard, to strengthen the police, to strengthen the border patrol, understanding that we need to have civilians that are armed and are able to be first responders before the police arrives to a scene.
Yeah, so you mentioned a few interesting things there. You allude to the situation last May, that's May 2021, and obviously it showed the real face of this, I think, to a certain extent, in terms of the anti-Semitism, because here in Los Angeles, there were anti-Semitic attacks, not against Israelis, even against Jews, right? So it really, I think, broke this facade of that this is something against Israel. This is Jew hatred at its core that you see being the animus for these terrorist attacks from the Palestinian authorities, from the Palestinian terrorists, which are supported by Palestinian authorities. Now, the Palestinian situation has become a little bit more interesting, I would say, the last couple of years. Obviously, Iran is one of the main benefactors, giving the resources to facilitate these terrorist activities. And since the Abraham Accords, it's been an interesting shift where you have, partly for economic reasons and partly maybe it's optimism to me for moral reasons as well. I think you see some of these Arab nations such as the UAE and Bahrain and others who look at the situation a little bit more objectively and say, well, this other side, there isn't really two sides working for peace. There's one side who wants it because it's in their best interest, of course, to have it, right? They're surrounded by nations that don't share religion with them, that traditionally, have tried to kill them, etc. And another side that's not willing to budge at all, that actually wants Israel, forget about making peace, they want it wiped off the map. And so now there's an interesting sort of coalition developing since these Abraham Accords broken under Trump, with the UAE and Israel strengthening ties, with Bahrain as well. Morocco seems to have come in as well. And you even see some different sorts of rhetoric from even the Saudis. And so these were all traditional benefactors of the Palestinian cause as well. Do you think that has changed things at all in terms of their ability to attack Israel and having that moral support sort of taken away from them? Or do you think they're still just as adamant and capable of wreaking carnage against Israel?
Okay, so let's understand what the Abraham Accords are all about, and then maybe it will be easier to understand. Mm-hmm. First of all, Iran aspires to, first of all, regional hegemony. They want to control all the Middle East. They want to destroy all these states, Sunni moderate states, the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, and so on. They want to control everything, and of course, destroy Israel as well. At the same time, these Sunni states, while they are very much threatened by Iran, they are also challenged by Sunni radical elements, like ISIS, like the Muslim Brotherhood, like Al-Qaeda, Taliban, and so on. So they are being destabilized from the inside by radical Sunni elements. Now, as long as the US was strong and dominant in the Middle East, before Obama's presidency, things were at balance. I mean, the US intervened where it needed to intervene, even went to war in Iraq, and so on. And the very strong presence of the US stabilized the area. This is something that started long ago with Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1945, where he signed this strategic alliance with the Saudis, all the way to Obama's presidency. What happened when Obama stepped into office is that for the first time in the history of this region and the US became completely independent of oil. The fracturing industry has managed to produce huge amounts of oil, and in one day, the US became not only independent, but also a major exporter of oil. And the Middle East at that moment completely lost its importance in American eyes in many ways. Now, when Obama looked at the Middle East in new eyes, because he wasn't dependent anymore on the Gulf states or Saudi Arabia, he saw Iran as an emerging force and sought some kind of alliance with them. And this was a shock, a completely shock to these two Sunni states who had an alliance for a long time with the US. And at the same time, while America in a way is shifting its alliance, moving towards the Iranians, at the same time, there was the Arab Spring and the radical Sunni started emerging. And to the surprise of these countries, in some cases, America supported these Sunni radical elements. We saw it with Morsi, when Morsi took control of Egypt, and his Muslim Brotherhood, this is a radical organization, Obama's administration supported him. So the Sunni Arab states realized that they cannot rely anymore on this alliance. They don't know what will happen. One election they will have a Democratic candidate winning, another one maybe Republican. It's not the same as it was before. It's not a consensus among American parties. So when they saw Israel standing firm against the Iranians, they realized that they need an alliance with Israel in order to be able to cope with the huge challenges Iran poses to the region. So it's first of all, it's an existential threat. Iran is an existential threat to all the Middle East. And this is why this alliance is so important. By the way, talking about Morocco, you would assume that Morocco is quite far away from Iran, but Iran is actually operating in Morocco. Iran is weaponizing Polisario, the same organization that is attacking Morocco. Iran is also weaponizing Algeria, which is an enemy of Morocco. And so this is why we are having this relationship and peace agreements.
Interesting.
Now, the Sunni Arab world is distancing itself from the Palestinian issue, but at the same time, you have Iran deeply involved with what's going on with the Palestinians, as you said, bringing know-how and money and support to Hamas and Islamic Jihad, using Hezbollah also to mobilize the Palestinians to attack Israelis. You know, we are mentioning now 20 years to Operation Defensive Shield that was held in Judea and Samaria. During that time, before Defensive Shield operation, there were more than 1,000 Israelis killed in major cities. Most of these attacks were initiated and funded by Hezbollah with Iranian money. So Iran is deeply involved. And at the same time, you have the American withdrawal from Afghanistan. This is creating waves of shock around the Middle East. The Sunni radical elements are getting stronger again. ISIS, just in the last year, in 2021, conducted 2,700 attacks with more than 8,000 people killed and injured.
In Syria?
Mostly in Afghanistan, also in Iraq, in Syria, in the Sinai Peninsula, and in Africa. Now, this is projecting also into the radical elements within the Israeli Arab society and the Palestinians. So you have a Sunni radical wave coming towards, and at the same time, a Shiite radical wave, which is going to grow exponentially once this nuclear agreement is signed and sanctions will be removed. The Iranians will get hundreds of billions of dollars. So this is destabilizing completely the Middle East. And frankly, I can't understand why the US administration is doing what it's doing. It's endangering the very existence of the state of Israel and the whole stability in the Middle East.
Right. So you touched on a couple interesting things there. One was that in a weird way, the Obama administration's sort of like incompetence and naivete and wrongheadedness about the Middle East almost facilitated in bringing some of the Israeli and Arab neighbors together because of the US's detachment and this sort of need for collective security. So that's pretty interesting, and that's positive. On the other hand, now we see with Biden continuing that policy, it's getting to a point where it's actually causing problems because of as you say, the rising Sunni tide of radicalism, as well as Iran putting its foot on the gas pedal in terms of exporting radical Shia Islam in these other countries as well. What's the problem with lifting sanctions from Iran for people who are sort of unfamiliar with this? What's the problem with the Iran nuclear deal? Well, first of all, and then of course, as a part of that is the lifting of sanctions. Will the Iran nuclear deal help, sort of facilitate, in essence, their nuclear capabilities? Is it just a canard, or is it a good thing to bring stability to the Middle East, as they say, the administration?
Iran is a country that signed the NPT. They're basically one of the countries that signed an agreement against nuclear weapons. Now, there is there isn't one state in the world that signed this agreement that is allowed by contract, by agreement, to enrich uranium. Now, this agreement with the Iranians basically says that within 3-4 years, the Iranians, the agreement will end, and the Iranians will be permitted by the world to enrich endless amount of uranium, meaning they will be able to produce maybe 100 nuclear bombs. Now, it's basically the world surrendering to this crazy regime that says clearly that they want to annihilate Israel, that are attacking countries all over the Middle East,
right?
That are building, by the way, a force in the backyard of the US in Venezuela, equipping them with UAVs that can reach the US and attack, terrorizing Morocco and trying to get control of Morocco because they want to control Gibraltar pass from the Middle East towards the ocean. And the moment Iran becomes nuclear, or even before, all the countries in the Middle East will want to be nuclear. They will have to defend themselves. So we'll see proliferation of nuclear capabilities everywhere, including their militias like Hezbollah. This is a threat to the globe. This is a threat to the world. And I cannot understand why Europe and the US are moving toward that. And so one thing is obviously the Iranians are seeking this nuclear umbrella. Now, look, they learned the lesson of Libya, and they're also learning the lesson of Ukraine. When Gaddafi announced that he has nuclear capabilities, he said, I'm willing to disarm my capabilities, get rid of them, if you accept me and I can trade with Europe and I'll have normalization. So the US and Europe said, sure, why not? Please get rid of your nuclear capabilities, and he did. And once he experienced an uprisal, NATO sent its planes and attacked him. So what's the message?
Right.
The message was, never give up your capabilities, because they won't keep their side of the bargain. The same happened with Ukraine. In the 1990s, Ukraine was asked to give up its nuclear capabilities. The US, Britain, Russia said, if you do that, we will assure that we will never be attacked. And now, not only the Russians are attacking Ukraine, the West is not doing anything, just talking, tweeting. So Iranians understand that if they want the regime to exist for the long term, they need nuclear capabilities, and they need the nuclear capabilities as an umbrella, so nobody will be able to attack them. And then they will mobilize all the militias, terrorize all the Middle East. They have missiles that can reach the US. So what's going on is completely crazy. I mean,
it's asinine. It's absolutely asinine. I mean, and to think that these people negotiating with Iran, the Iranians are hard negotiators, and they're just buying into this idea that they're going to be global players into the international community, responsible players. Of course, it's in their best interest to have nuclear weapons. They're a regime that's unstable from within. They fear regime change from without, from places like the United States and other places. Well, mostly US, but maybe Europe as well, NATO as well. And there's just no one, all the incentives are aligned for them to be able to spread their terror and to get this nuclear weapon. And they have assurances that the terrorist mullahs who are in control of that country get to hang on power. One of the other interesting things that happened recently was that, Biden reached out to the Saudis and the UAE in terms of trying to get them to ramp up some oil production because of the oil domestic policy that the current administration is against. And they didn't even return the calls of the president of the United States, which is just unbelievable.
Of course not, because listen, I mean, this administration is pushing the Middle East into war.
Right.
Really endangering us. And it makes no sense. Now, Israel is left with one choice only, to take our future in our hands,
right,
and prepare an attack on these nuclear facilities. And obviously, we need to do that. And obviously, if we do that, this is going to be war. And this is where we are being pushed to the corner, and they have to deal alone with this reality, maybe with some help from the Sunni states that will help in one way or another. Really, usually I consider myself as somebody who is able to, when I see something major going around the globe, to understand the interests. I can talk about why the Russians are invading Ukraine. I understand Russian interests. Can agree or not with what they're doing, but I understand what they're doing.
Right.
I cannot understand this administration. It makes no sense. The only good explanation I got about this behavior is keeping Obama's legacy. That's it. Other than that, no, doesn't make sense.
Yeah, putting the world at risk in order to preserve a failing legacy. It's just, I agree. I mean, but so many parts of this administration are just unfathomable, domestically and internationally. And the U.S.'s role in the world is becoming weakened significantly, because not only are we not, nature abhors a vacuum, right? As they say. So not only are we not fulfilling obligations in terms of trying to promote peace in the Middle East, you see with the Russia-Ukraine situation as well. And here's another thing I want to talk to you about. So one of the main players in terms of trying to mediate the conflict is not the United States, who has no standing really to do this because of failed policies, and just horrible rhetoric coming from the Biden administration. But it's Israel. Israel's playing like a leading role in trying to mediate this dispute. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of Israel's role and how that's shaping up?
Yeah, well, I'm not that happy about the Israeli involvement, because I think it's sending a message that we have time to deal with other things other than the Iranian deal. I would expect the Israeli Prime Minister to really be focused on the Iranian issue, and I think this government, unfortunately, is not. If it was for me and I was Prime Minister, I would take all the cabinet and the Knesset members to Vienna and build tents outside these meeting rooms and don't move there until this process stops, because this is really endangering us. So I don't think that Israel has anything serious to offer in this mediation, because we are in a close relationship with Russia, talking about the need to coordinate with them in Lebanon, and in Syria. They are present in our neighborhood.
Explain for people not familiar why Israel needs to have Russia to coordinate with them.
Okay, so let's understand Russians for a moment. One of the major interests of Russia is what we call hot water, being able to maintain a huge fleet in waters that don't freeze in the winter. Because most of the sea around Russia, it freezes in the winter. They need to keep their ships either in the Black Sea or in the Mediterranean Sea. And obviously, keeping them in the Mediterranean Sea is better, so they need ports. One of the major strategic ports of the Russians is located in Syria. So Syria, for the Russians, is an important place, and they want to defend their port. So they are assisting this vicious regime for a long time. They have brought to Syria very sophisticated capabilities, mainly air defense. Some of them can endanger our airplanes, but they are utilizing the advanced weapons. Now, because they are spread around Syria, when we attack Iranians that are moving towards our border, and when we attack shipments of missiles that are moving from Iran to Hezbollah, we're doing it on Syrian soil near Russian forces. And therefore, we need to be very, very closely coordinated. And if for some reason our relationship with the Russians derails, they can make us quite a hard time in managing to do what we need to do. And it's a very crucial issue for us to prevent Hezbollah from getting this missile. So we need to keep a very close coordination with Russia. So we need to be careful the way we are handling ourselves around the Russian-Ukrainian crisis. As much as we sympathize Ukraine, and we are against the fact that Russia invaded Ukraine, and of course against the atrocities we see in Ukrainian cities. But talking about real politics, we need to be careful, and we are, to a certain extent.
Got it. Yeah, that's an interesting angle that most people have never really explored. Just shows you sort of the trying to balance the many national security challenges you have and how you have to navigate through those. What's your opinion on Saudi Arabia? Obviously, UAE and Bahrain coming closer with Israel in terms of both economically and looks like maybe national security ties as well. Do you think Saudi Arabia is going to come closer to Israel, and at least their rhetoric will demonstrate that more, given the just insane policies that the US and the West are having towards Iran and essentially bolstering their ability to export their terror around the world? Do you think that brings Saudi Arabia to more openly build better relations with Israel?
I think that we already have good relations, although we don't have a formal peace. There is a lot of meetings, a lot of talking. I think that what's happening in Saudi is that you still have the old regime, the old king, is the old school. It's hard for him to, adapt to the new realities of the Middle East. But you have the young generation of Saudis that understand that they need a closer relationship with Israel. So maybe with the Saudis, it's taking a bit more time, but below the surface, there is a lot of things going on between Israel and the Saudis.
And I'm going to ask you a little bit about the Israeli military, and then we can finish off with things you're concerned about and things you're hopeful for. Israel being such a formidable military, small population, one of the most advanced militaries in the world in terms of cyber capabilities, an excellent air force, a all-around very, very effective military force, and among the best intelligence, maybe the best intelligence in the world next to the United States. What do you think Israel's advantages are in terms of makes it such a tiger, given its relatively small size in the world? It's a country size of New Jersey with 9 million population around there. What do you attribute that to?
Two things. One is conscription, and the fact that we are Jews. So the fact that you have very, very smart people, and they're all being sent to the army, it's conscription. You are able to get the best minds of Israel at a very young age to join the military. And the military has 2.5, 3 years to shape them and convince them also to stay in the army. And many of them do, and they stay in the army as officers. And so you get the best of the best. It's a completely different world having conscription and getting all the best people you have in the country into the army than having a professional army where usually all the able people go to university and careers, and all the people that don't have a real career go to the army because they don't have another choice. So really the secret of Israel is it's people. I served 30 years in the military, and in my last day, they held me a party and so on. And then they asked me, what will you remember for all this, 30 years? What's the thing that most impacted you? And I said, it was the endless amount of amazing people I met. I met so many people who are so able. And this is our secret. This is the secret. It's all about the people. People at the age of 18, 19 in the Israeli army do things that people maybe 40, 50 years old do in other places. Now, this is also building a much stronger society overall. The army is the best university you can imagine. People learn leadership. They are given responsibilities you wouldn't get decades, At the age of 22, I commanded more than 100 people in very complex missions. Managing 100 people outside of the military, it takes many years to, when I was 22, I took a few months off and I flew to visit my parents. My father was at the time Israel's ambassador in Colombia. So I arrived at this young age to visit my parents, and I visit my father in the embassy. And he's an ambassador, he's very experienced. And I spent half a day in the embassy. And I look at the way my father is managing his people, with the eyes of a manager. And I'm 22 years old. And at the end of the day, I sit to talk with my father, and I start telling him what I think he can do better. The way he's managing the people. This is what what the army enables you to.
Certainly more valuable skills than majoring in gender studies. You guys get some more concrete skills at a young age.
Definitely.
Yeah, and just
the army takes you really. The army challenges you in every possible way, and you need to be at your best in everything to succeed.
Yeah, and you certainly see that mentality basically manifest itself as well in terms of obviously Israel's tech community, which is I think Israel is number 3 in public companies in the world. So it's like America and China, and then Israel, this tiny little country, is up there with these two behemoths. Some of the most valuable technology companies that we have in the world were either bought by American companies that were Israeli based, Israeli companies, or they're Israeli companies, right? So it's certainly played itself out in the economic fields and the technology fields as well, and private enterprise. And there certainly seems to be a strong connection there.
Yeah, I think that, one of the things that Israel and the US can do much better together. Today, you see Russia, China, India, they are challenging the supremacy of technological supremacy of the US. And the US is finding itself in a situation where it's harder and harder to compete with all the East, And in this sense, I think Israel is an opportunity. I think that we should deepen much more the connection and the joint development of basic technologies like hypersonic missiles, like quantum computing, and other basic fields. Israel can definitely assist a lot in making a US that is much more competitive in this complex world that we are living.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's just somebody who follows the public markets. It's just amazing to see, and it's like almost every few weeks you'll see a major acquisition of a company. And it's like almost always Israeli. It's like there's an Israeli company every few weeks being bought out by a multi-billion-dollar American-based company. And you hear quotes from like people like Bill Gates, and saying famously like Microsoft is also very much an Israeli company, right? Because of how much of Israeli technology has helped power that. IBM as well. It's just an incredible thing, and it goes to show you what people who are committed to excellence, who weren't blessed with natural resources, right? It's like one of the few places in the Middle East where Israel got the short end of the stick in terms of natural resources. There's not.
Yeah, but even that is not true anymore. We find so much gas now.
That's right.
Export gas to Europe.
Right, and that's because of technology improvements, right? That's able to get those gas. Is that correct? The innovations.
Well, it's actually more international companies, that for a long time looked in the sea for natural reserves of gas, and at a certain point we found a lot of gas. And then now, by the way, one of the things that is happening with the Ukrainian-Russian war is two interesting things that affect Israeli relations with Europe. One, that of course, Eastern Europe, Northern Europe, they are all in shock, by this Russian army marching into Europe. So everybody is now investing more in military capabilities. And all of the Israeli industries are now in Europe, in Finland, in Sweden, in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Germany. Everybody wants to buy and procure Israeli technology and know-how. So in this case, we are really deepening our relationships, signing very huge agreements, G2G, government to government. And the other issue is the fact that Europe is dependent on Russian gas and they're looking for alternative. Israel has become a very viable and interesting alternative for Europe.
It's amazing. Yeah, that's an incredible story. So let's finish off here with, things you're most worried about in the short to medium term? We discussed it a bit, but if you could game out sort of, let's assume this Iran deal goes forward, unfortunately, because of just the massive amounts of incompetence coming out of our administration right now. I assume that's probably the biggest threat, and how Israel sorts of how they would game plan out, how they'd see it out in terms of dealing with that threat. And then something that you're hopeful about in the medium to long term.
Well, I think that if this agreement is signed, Israel will need to invest a whole different amount of money and attention in the IDF, police, and so on, because basically we'll enter a period of time where war will be something that might happen. Need to be prepared for possible against Iran nuclear capabilities or an Iranian attack on a certain point. What I can hope for, I hope that that something will happen that will enable this agreement to be signed. At the moment, the Russians are a bit, stopping the process, but I don't know how long. And then, usually, really, I don't like to deal with American politics, but it's affecting so much what is happening here. So we are looking very closely on what will happen in November. And of course, we are looking at what will happen in 2 years from now. And if we are not in war in the next 2 years, I truly hope that there will be an administration that understands who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. And that will deal finally with the Iranian threat once and for all. And with the Iranians, unfortunately, talking won't cut it. We need to destroy these capabilities. I don't think Israel needs to deal with this alone. I think it's a global threat. And we need to deal with this.
An administration who knows who the good guys and who the bad guys are. What a concept. But I think that we're going to see some positive developments on that front. This madness can't go on. And I think the whole world is starting to see and particularly Americans are starting to see what happens when you get some of the most incompetent, worst people in power. And the results aren't very good. And I think that I'm very confident that things will change in that direction. We'll get somebody in who will stem the tide and start making good decisions again, start exhibiting competence and strength around the world. So appreciate you coming on, Amir. It was a fascinating discussion. It was amazing to get your perspective on things. Is there anywhere that people can learn? Is there anywhere people can learn more about you or follow you?
Yes, definitely. I mean, we didn't talk about the organization as I lead, but I 2 years ago, I decided to build a new organization, and it had huge traction. Today, we have more than 3,000 high-ranking officers, commanders, and operators in reserve from all the Israeli defense establishment, all devoted to one thing and one thing only: ensuring the security and prosperity of the state of Israel and the Jewish people for generations to come. And we deal a lot with educating the young generation. We're doing it on a large scale in Israel, and we're hoping to reach also to the young generation in the diaspora. We are very active in media and social media, and we have a research department. We meet a lot with the diplomats, Congress, Senate, Europe, Knesset, and so on. The organization is growing really fast because there is a need. We understand that the national security is a big deal. You can find us in idsf.org.il, our website, and subscribe and get the latest news of what's going on here.
Amazing. We'll make sure we'll put that in the show notes. idsf.org.il. Doing great work. Thanks so much for being on. Really appreciate it, man.
Thank you, Ashton. It was really a pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed our show, please click subscribe to stay up to date with our YouTube channel and podcast, and give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts so that we can keep delivering guys some great content. Thanks for listening, and we will be back next week.
We're going to talk about the issues that really matter. Our country, our economy, the Fed, QE, GDP, BTC, NFTs, AOC, the CCP, Cardi B, Yeezy, Yellow Socks, Iran, Joe Biden's dementia, come on, man, and probably sex robots. We stand for a free and open debate and exchange of ideas. And if you disagree with anything we talk about, you are a racist and no better than Hitler. What? Let's get started.